colors. And the point of that is to try to make it easier, I guess, to keep track of which axis is which. However, it sort of defeats the point of having a widget at all, because if you've got that widget and you, for some reason, have to know which axis things are pointing towards, you can always just check out that widget and know right away. To me, having a bunch of different colors and extra lines and things on the screen just adds to visual noise and distracts you from the actual object or scene you're trying to work on, which is why all of these lines are kept monotone in Sensei format.
Software.
However, if you really prefer them to be colored the way they are or just some other color, you can click under Display here and then click Customize Theme.
I know a lot of us
and down here where it says Grid and XYZ, you could change these grid lines to whatever you want, and notice both the grid line color changes as well as the part of the widget. And if you wanted to keep those changes, you could press Save Changes there. And if later you decide, you know what, that is kind of pointless, I don't need a bunch of bright colors distracting me from what I'm working on, when I already know that if this thing is pointing this way, then that means X, and that thing's pointing that way, then that means Y, and Z is up and down, you can come back here and press Reset. So I'll close that up and close Display as well. Me personally, I really like to usually work in full screen mode unless I'm having to do something with the camera or properties panel or something. And you can make any panel in Blender full screen by pressing the tilde key. That's the little squiggly key under your escape key on your keyboard. So if you hover your mouse over any one of these areas, you can make it full screen by tapping this key. But the way I usually like to make my main 3D view workspace big is by pressing this full screen button here. It's a really convenient way to remove all the distractions from this single thing you're working on when you don't need to be messing with animation or the camera or properties or something else. So I'm going to go ahead and press that full screen button there. Okay, so before we transform or constrain, transform, anything else, let's add some more objects to this scene for a little variety. So I'm going to press 1 to go into front view. Notice that whenever you are in an orthographic view, such as 1 for front, 2 for back, 3 for left, 4 for right, 5 for top, or 6 for bottom, wherever you drag your 3D cursor, that's this little lifesaver looking dealie, by right-clicking, whenever you let go in one of these modes, the 3D cursor will automatically snap to a point on the grid. Also, if you use your scroll wheel to zoom in, you'll notice that this grid constantly subdivides as you zoom in or zoom out. We can bring up our add menu to add objects to our scene in two different ways. We can either double right-click, which will move our 3D cursor and bring up the add menu, sort of a quick way of adding an object to wherever you click. And I could add, say, a cone, or you can drag your 3D cursor by holding the right mouse button, then letting it go somewhere, and add an object the traditional way by pressing Shift A to bring up the add menu. And we could, say, add a torus shape here. I'm just going to double right click and add a few more random shapes so we've got different kind of stuff to do stuff to here. Okay. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different objects. So let's try transforming them. So let's click on the cone. And of course we can press R to rotate. And if we want to constrain this rotation, we can use the same techniques we used to scale that cube. We could press Y to constrain our transformation to the Y-axis, or X to constrain it to the X-axis, or Z to constrain it to the Z-axis. So I could click the Suzanne head and press R to rotate, and then constrain that rotation to the X-axis there. And I could select this torus here. And if I wanted to rotate it along this Y-axis, I could just press R and then Y and rotate it that way. We can also do the same thing when we're moving things or when we're pressing G to grab. So I could press G to grab to move this sphere, but then I could press Y, and this would constrain the movement to the Y-axis, or I could press X, that would constrain it to the X-axis, or Z, which would constrain it to the Z axis. Once again, if I start to perform a transformation, say I press G to grab and Z to constrain it to the Z axis, but then all of a sudden I realize, you know what, I don't really want to move that. We can right click to cancel whatever we were doing. So pressing X, Y, or Z after you have pressed R to rotate, S to scale, or G to grab is one way that you can constrain your transformations, but a much more intuitive way, and the way I usually prefer to constrain my transformations, is by tapping and holding the middle mouse button down after you have begun a transformation. So say for instance, I click on this cube and I want to move this cube somewhere. Say I want to move it up there. Now I could press G to grab it, and then I could consult this little widget and see, okay, this line here is going that way. That means that's the y-axis. So I'll tap Y, and then this will let me move this along the y-axis. I could do that. But my favorite way to constrain transformations is just to tap and hold the middle mouse button, and then you can just gesture your mouse towards whatever direction you want, and it will just go in the direction that you want. And this way, there's no worry about what axis you're on or figuring out the details of it. You just basically tell the computer to put it where you want it. So when I press G to grab, I can hold middle mouse down to constrain, and then now wherever I aim this object, it will be automatically stuck to whatever axis I sort of tell it to go. So this is my favorite way of constraining things, and it works with moving things. Or if I was going to rotate this, I could press R to rotate, hold down middle mouse to constrain, and then just click and hold down the middle mouse button until I see that the object is spinning or rotating in the direction I want. As soon as I see it's going in the direction I want, I can let go of the middle mouse button, and then it will be locked to transforming in that direction. But if I all of a sudden change my mind, say, you know what, I don't want this spinning around the Z-axis, I want it spinning around this one here, which is the Y-axis. When I consult my little widget, what I can do is hold down the middle mouse button again and move it around until it is doing what I want. Then I let go. You can actually see some of those lines disappear, and now you're definitely locked in rotating in the direction you want this to go, and you just rotate it till you're happy and click to confirm. So same with scaling, so I could press S to scale. And if I wanted to scale it out long ways, I could hold middle mouse down and drag this out like this. Or if I wanted to scale it up and down on the Z-axis, I could hold my middle mouse button down and gesture up, and that happens. Now usually this works really well. Occasionally you can be looking at something in like a weird angle or something, and you'll try to constrain a transformation by holding the middle mouse button down, but you might find it really difficult to get it to actually spin or scale or move in the constraint axis you want to. So then at that point you might have to resort to pressing X, Y, or Z, but most of the time you don't have to. You can just press down the middle mouse button until Blender figures out where you're trying to get it to do, and then you let go once it's locked and you're good to go. Another interesting way of controlling your transformations is just by actually putting Blender into different views. So for instance, if I were to press 1 to go into front view and then select this cone right here, if I were to press R to rotate this cone, it's automatically going to be restricted to rotating towards whatever axis the view is facing towards. So in front view, it's going to be restricted to rotating like that, and I could right click to cancel that. Or if I were to press 5 to go into top view and press R to rotate it, notice it's constricted to rotating that way as well. Or if I were to click this Suzanne monkey head and press R to rotate it, notice it's also constricted that way. So that's another quick visual way to get something to rotate in the way you want it to if you're having trouble. Okay, so I've showed you about transformations, that is rotating, scaling, and moving objects. Then I've showed you how to constrain those transformations, either by tapping one of these axis directions or just by the much better way, holding middle mouse button to gesture towards the way you want it to go, so you can, like a child, just say, go that way, and it does what you want it to do, which is my favorite way. But there's a third level of control that we can gain through hotkeys when transforming things, and that is by actually holding the control key. So if I were to click this cone here and say I wanted to rotate it only a quarter circle exactly. For starters, I could press R to rotate, and then I could hold down my middle mouse button until I saw that it was rotating around the axis I want, which is that one. And finally, the third level of control here is by literally holding control on the keyboard, and this will cause this to snap in increments, and this lets me get a precise rotation like this. So if I were to press 1 to go into front view, which, whoops, looks like I didn't actually do because I was looking at it at the wrong angle. So press Control Z to do that. But if in front view, I press R to rotate, and I'm already constrained along this axis, so if I hold Control, I can get this to rotate more precisely. Or if, let's say I would press 5 to go into top view, I can press R to rotate it like this, hold Control, and as you can see there, I can get super snapped rotations as well. Same thing for scaling. I could press S to scale this, middle mouse to constrain, and then I could hold Control to get it to snap in increments. So if you prefer not to hold Control, you can actually click this Snap During Transform button here, which is located here on the Builder menu, as well as down here on the 3D View header menu, and that's the same thing as holding Control while you do a transformation such as scale, or rotate, or move, or G to grab. See how it's snapping like that? So Control is just a fast way to get it to do that if you don't want to leave that on all the time. So down here on the 3D View header menu, we've got over where you see this sort of little multicolored peace sign thing, which is actually an icon of what this widget looks like in Blender default. This is the 3D Manipulator Widget. If we click and turn this on, this will add a visual widget to whatever object we have selected, which allows us to transform in the 3 different ways that we've talked about. So right now, only 2 of the 3 ways are activated. So we've got location, that's where we press G to grab and move stuff to different locations. That's pushed down. And then we have the rotation option represented by a little curved arc there. However, the 3rd way that we transform things, which is by scaling, is not pressed in, so we don't see an option for that on this widget. But if we were to hold Shift and click this, we would then see these little cube icons pop up on our 3D Manipulator widget, and that means if we press those, they will be scaled in whatever direction that we press them. So by default, only the location part of the widget is available. So if you just want one of these items available, you can just click on it. Or if you want multiple, you can hold Shift and add those until you customize your widget however you want. So if we click on the little arrowhead of this widget, this will move our object in the direction of the little arrowhead. Or if we click one of the round parts of the widget, this will rotate the object in that direction. And of course, if we click on one of the little cube things, which represent the scale part of the transform, it will scale the object. Now, if we take a look at this widget, it really starts from here and then ends where this button is that says global. And this is really all a part of this widget's control options. So if we click where it says global, notice there are several different options available here. Honestly, I only ever use 2 options with this, which are global and normal. So when this widget is set to global, it's basically going to allow you to transform things along these XYZ axis here. So when I press up like that, you definitely can understand whenever you press it which way things are going to go. And like I said, the only other option I use here is normal. A normal is basically telling us what direction is a polygon facing. So for instance, with this torus shape right here, which is made of a bunch of different 4-sided polygons here, if we press tab to go into edit mode, we can actually get some information of exactly how many faces, polygon faces, this object is composed of, and it turns out to be 576. When we get out of edit mode and head back to object mode, we get information about the entire scene. But if you want to know exactly what's going on with one particular object, you can press tab and learn about it. While we are in edit mode, we have this option in our property shelf over here, once again that shows up when we press T, called mesh display. And this item goes away when you're in object mode, so watch, it will disappear when I press tab to go back into object mode here. But in edit mode, we have this available. And down here, there's an option that says normals. So if I click this space button right here, you'll see these little blue lines pop up all around the polygons of this object. I can actually use this size slider to increase the size of these little lines. And all these little lines are telling us is what direction are these faces pointed, which in a lot of situations, this may seem, pretty obvious. So it's like, yeah, I get that that's sort of facing that way. I don't really need this thing to tell me which way they're facing, but in some situations it can help. So basically that's all a normal is. It's information about what direction is that polygon facing. So I'll go ahead and shut that off and press tab to go back into object mode. And the need to change this to normal sometimes can be explained pretty well with this cube that we've transformed a bunch over here. Right now, imagine that I wanted to scale this cube out towards the direction that it was facing. So I wanted this face to go out that way and that face to go out that way. Currently with this on global, if I try to do that, there's no option to get it to scale in the direction that we want. But if we change this to normal, which as we just explained with the torus over here, the widget will now transform, that is, rotate, move, or scale along the directions of the object's normals. So if we press tab to go into edit mode, under mesh display, turn on the normal view for this thing, this is the direction it's going to scale. That's much more like we want. So when we press tab to go back into object mode, and we click on this thing to scale, notice it's scaling how we want. So if most of that went over your head, just remember that at some point in the future, if you're desperately trying to get something to scale, but it's like it's just not bending in the way you want it to, try switching this from global to normal, and you may find some success with being able to transform, that is, rotate, move, or scale your object in the direction that you're desperately trying to get it to go, but it just won't seem to go. So that's what switching this to normal is good for. So the final method of transforming we can do is with menus. If you'll notice here over on the property shelf, while in object mode, we have this transform menu. And if we click this open, we'll have a lot of direct values we can use. So rather than using a widget to transform something or a hotkey to transform something, we can enter these values in directly with the transform menu. However, available in Sensei format is a menu that is similar to this transform menu, but has a few more options and I think cleans it up just a little bit. So I usually prefer to, instead of use that, to click open this dimensions box. And to get a better idea of this, what I'm going to go ahead and do is click this to turn off our widget. Press A to select everything, X to delete, and I'm going to press Shift C, which recenters my 3D cursor to the center of the grid. Press Shift A and add a cube. So here we can see that under the scale, this cube is 2 by 2 by 2. And as far as location, it's exactly at 0, 0, and rotation is all set to 0 as well. If I want to transform this object, I can do it directly with values. So I can either say click this X value here and manually drag it, or if I knew I wanted it to be exactly however many units over, I could click here and say press 5, and that would put that 5 units over. Now notice here under units that we are now set to none, so these values are Blender's internal units, but they don't really mean anything. If you want to, you can switch this to either the metric or imperial system. So if I were to switch imperial, now we're dealing with feet and inches and stuff like that. And if I wanted to reset this, the location of this cube, I could come over here and press reset all. And that would reset all of the transformations, that is location, rotation, and scale that we've done to the cube thus far. And down here, this actually lets me control the actual units of the grid. So right now it's set up to be 1 foot by 1 foot. That's one grid unit. But I could say make it to 5. And so say I wanted this cube to be exactly 5 feet over. I could come over here to where it says X, enter 5, and so now it's gone 5 feet over, which is what we've set the grid up to be exactly. That's why it went over 1 unit. So we can enter manual rotation values here, so I could put like 90 on the Y, which you can't really tell the difference because it's a cube. Okay, let's not use a cube. Let's add something like this monkey head so we can actually tell when it's rotating. Okay, so for instance, if I were to enter 90 here, we can see that rotated this exactly 90 degrees, or say I wanted 180 on the Z value. Now we've done that, or we could play with these sliders and what have you. Notice that under the scale part of the dimension, we have a little bit more room to work with X, Y, and Z values, because this obviously the scale of something can be like a huge number, whereas rotation and location aren't usually that large to deal with. If ever you're having trouble seeing this, you can always drag this menu out and see this more clearly if you want. But in the same way that we learned to constrain our transformations by, say, if we wanted to rotate this thing and constrain it to the X-axis, we tap X. Or we just press R to rotate and then middle mouse to constrain and move it towards the direction we want it to go. Once we see it's doing that, we let go of the middle mouse and now it's constrained there. In the same way we can constrain those, we can actually lock these transform values so that whenever you go to transform the object, it's only possible for the object to move in the direction you want it to. So for instance, I could press X to delete this monkey head, I'll press Shift A, under mesh, add a cube, S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, S to scale, middle mouse to constrain again, S to scale, middle mouse to constrain again, and bring that in. So say I had something like this, and I knew that I only ever wanted this thing to rotate around this way, like this, so I guess that's around the Z axis there. What I could do is under rotation, lock everything but the Z axis. So this is another way of constraining transformations. If I lock the X and lock the Y, now when I press R to rotate, I don't have to manually press Z or constrain anything, because it's only possible, no matter what happens, for this thing to rotate in one of those axes that aren't locked. So the only one that's not locked is Z. So now whenever I press R to rotate, it's only ever gonna rotate like that. Same thing with any of these other transform types. So if I were to say lock the Z and the Y axis and I press G to grab, this thing is only ever going to move down that X axis no matter what I do. So I don't have to manually press X after I press G to move it, or try to use my middle mouse to constrain, because when I press G to grab, as you can see that little value going up in none of the others, it's only ever going to move like that. So same deal with scale. So say I locked Z and locked X and I press S to scale. Now it's only ever going to scale along the Y axis. Make it into something like this. But no going and editing stuff in edit mode, which we haven't really talked about the difference between object mode and edit mode just yet. We're going to save that for another video. But for more advanced users, part of this challenge is that you cannot go into edit mode and then say edit part of your shape here, or say extrude something out and what have you. So we want to see what can we accomplish using nothing but these primitive shapes and our mad transform skills. At the end, I'm going to walk you through performing a basic render, and then I'm going to post my creation on the Crash Course forum at blendersensei.com, and I'd be really excited to see anything that other people make as well. I'm probably going to be rendering this in Blender Render, but you can feel free to render it in Cycles, whichever you want. Also allowed will be using smooth shading if you want to, so you can add that to any of your objects. And if you know how to use lamps and lighting in Blender, feel free to use that in the challenge as well, with the exception of using any kinds of colored lights. So just make sure they're on a scale from white to black, and you're not using any colors like red, green, or whatever. And then obviously basic things like duplicating objects is also fine for the challenge, as well as any other stuff you see me do in this video when I'm making my own entry to the challenge. Obviously that's okay to do because I made up the challenge. So I'm going to be making a sort of an outdoor scene with a house and a fence, I think, but you can feel free to, make weapons. Like you could make some kind of cool sword, or like a crazy gun with all kinds of barrels, or maybe something simple like a table or some sort of weird vehicle. The sky's the limit. So before I get started with my entry into the challenge, I want to talk about just a handful of things that are going to tie in with the stuff we learned in the last video that will really give you a big advantage down the road when it comes to transforming things. So I'm going to go to File, press New, and reload Startup File so I can reset my scene and everything. So a really important topic that we didn't really talk about when we went over transformations in the last video were how transformations behave relative to an object's origin point. So the origin point of an object in the 3D view is just that little orange dot sitting in the object. So right now, actually, the 3D cursor, the little red and white lifesaver looking thing, is on top of the origin point, but if I right click and move it over here somewhere, you can see that little orange dot sitting in this object when we have it selected, when it's highlighted in orange. So if I were to double right click over here and say add a cone, or double right click over here and say add a torus, and double right click here and say add a cylinder, whenever we click on one of these objects, you'll see this little orange dot in the middle of them. That orange dot is called the object's origin point, and it's sort of a similar concept in a lot of programs. So Photoshop has something like this, Illustrator has something like this, a lot of programs, and sometimes it's referred to as pivot point or center point, but basically it means whenever we're transforming stuff, rotating, scaling, and what have you, that those transformations take place relative to where that origin point is. And we'll be discussing the origin point a lot more in a future video, as well as the other stuff I'm about to quickly tell you about before we get started with this challenge. But it'd be good if you had like a basic outline of what these things do before we move forward. So right now, if I press S to scale, notice that when I scale in really small, this cylinder gets real close to that orange dot because it's scaling to and from that orange dot. However, we can move that orange dot, the origin point, real simply. If we hold Shift and right-click somewhere on our cylinder, then we can snap the 3D cursor to any part of this object's mesh. And the mesh is the gray matter stuff inside of the object. It's what actually makes this object up. It's all the 3D polygon faces that compose this thing. So if I were to shift right click to here, it would snap to this edge, or if I shift right click here, the cursor would snap to that little vertex point, or if we shift right click in the middle of a polygon face, it will snap to the middle of it. However, if we shift and double right click, that will change the origin point of that object. So I'll hold Shift and double right click. Now the origin point of this object is set to the top here. So notice what happens now when we scale this object. It scales entirely to and from that point on the top. Same thing when we go to rotate it. So it's going to be real interested in where that origin point is. So let me take a second to tell you an old man story, because I'm getting closer to being an old man. And it's about the first time I ever started using Blender. And the first time I started using Blender, I had this real simple goal. I wanted to be able to make a door and animate it opening and closing. And I found this so frustrating that after days of trying, I quit using Blender for years. If only I had understood a few core concepts about how transformation works, then I would have kept on. Right now, if I were to select this cube and press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, and flatten it up, and then S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, and point my mouse along the Z-axis, and of course once you've got it going the way you want, you can let go of that middle mouse button and just move the mouse, and I could click. So if I had something shaped like a door here, and I wanted to rotate this like a door, right now if I try to rotate this, well, if I don't constrain that rotation, it's just going to go anywhere. But I could either tap Z on my keyboard to get it to rotate vertically, or I could, of course, click down on my middle mouse button and just point this towards the direction I want to rotate. So right now it's not rotating very much like a door. So the way we would do that is move this origin point to a place where it would cause this to rotate like a door. So can you guess where that origin point needs to go? Correct, it needs to go over here. So if we shift double right click over here, that will move this object's origin point to the center of this plane here. Now if I press R to rotate and then constrain this rotation with either holding middle mouse or tapping Z, notice it is now rotating like a door. Well, almost. Probably it would be better if that origin point, instead of in the middle of that thing, was actually on this edge, and then it would be a lot closer to what we wanted. So what we can do is, if we hold shift and right click on this edge, we'll see this cursor snap to the center of that edge. Once again, if we want the origin to move there, we can hold shift and double right click. And now when we press R to rotate, and then constrain it along the axis we want, like this, it's behaving much more like we would want a door to rotate. Of course, if you know that what you've got here is a door, and you don't want to have to constrain this thing every time you rotate it, you want it to rotate the same way every time, you can always press T under Dimensions, where it says Rotation. You can lock all of the axes except for Z, which we've been having to constrain every time after we press R to rotate, which sucks. So let's lock these up. Now when we press R to rotate, this thing will never behave like anything other than a door. So cool. So we've got one more area to cover before we dive into the challenge that's going to really tie in all this cool stuff you've been learning about transformation, and that is this pivot point menu. Now, a lot of what this menu really exists for is to help you handle transformations when dealing with multiple objects. So up until now, we've basically been transforming just one object at a time, but this really helps you manage situations where you need to transform a bunch of stuff you have selected at once. But we're going to briefly go over each one of these options here, just so you have a basic reference point in the future and you're a little bit better prepared. So the first thing that you'll notice about these top two options, active element and medium point, is that they behave exactly the same if you only have one object selected. So like I said, a lot of this menu is about how do we deal